This video is going to provide you with a complete guide to capturing incredible cinematic footage with the DJI Osmo Action 5 Pro. This video is going to have four main sections. The first section is going to be the tools you need. The second section is going to be the settings you need. The third section is going to talk about techniques. And the fourth section is going to show you how to edit that footage to get the maximum cinematic impact. So in order to capture incredible cinematic footage with the DJI Osmo Action 5 Pro, you're going to need two main tools. The first tool you're going to need is a gimbal. And the gimbal that I personally recommend is this very budget-friendly Hohem iSteady Pro 4. And the great thing about this gimbal is this gimbal costs less than $100. It's nothing fancy, but it accomplishes one main purpose that you need it to. You need this gimbal to prevent those micro jitters in your footage that you're capturing. And the reason you need to prevent those micro jitters is because tool number 2, which is ND filters, when you have those attached, you're going to use a shutter speed that fulfills the 180-degree shutter angle. And if you're filming in 24, 30 frames per second, a shutter speed is going to be 1/50 or 1/60, respectively. When you're filming footage in shutter speeds that are that slow, there's going to be jitter and ghosting in your footage with rock steady turned on. So what this gimbal is going to allow you to do is it's still going to allow you to keep rock steady on, but you're also going to have additional stabilization from this gimbal. This gimbal is going to be enough to prevent those micro jitters, but if you had rock steady off with this gimbal, the footage would still have quite a bit of movement in it still. And if you try to put that footage into something like gyroflow later on, with that slow of a shutter speed, the footage is not always going to stabilize perfectly because of the shutter speed being so slow. So that's why I highly recommend this gimbal. And tool number 2 that I mentioned are these ND filters right here. This particular pack is from Freewell, and I love these ND filters. They allow me to get that 180-degree shutter angle. Even if it's a really bright day, I can still get that in my footage, and my footage looks absolutely incredible. This filter pack also has the polarizer built into it. So if you're by bright water or it's a bright sunny day and you want to get those deeper, richer colors, these will allow you to do that. So first here, I'd like to show you how to get the Osmo Action 5 mounted on the iSteady 4 Pro gimbal. The keys for you to know is there is no balancing with this gimbal, which is a very good thing. There are plenty of gimbals out there that require a lot of balancing, and it can get pretty complex and complicated and messy and can be kind of hard to do. You just want to make sure this is facing toward you right here. And you want to have the orange clip on the bottom here like this. And then you're just going to set your Action 5 Pro right in here. And it's going to tuck into that cradle. And then you're just going to hold on to it here while you pull this up. And then the orange clip is going to clip in right here. There's a little slot for it. It's really easy. And then to power on the gimbal, just going to turn it around here. You're just going to push and hold on this red power button, and it's going to pop on right there, and it's going to default to that central position there. And as far as the modes on this gimbal when using it, you've got a couple different ones. The PF mode is pan follow. So what it's going to do when you're following an object, it's still going to allow for up and down panning or left and right. It's going to go with you. So you can see if I do that, it kind of moves along gently. If I go up and down, it moves a little bit that way as well. But it's not going to be any sharp, rapid movements like the POV mode would be. The other mode I find myself using most often is the L mode, and the L mode is the lock mode. So when you're going along with that gimbal, it's going to lock it horizontally and vertically. So if you really don't want your camera moving much at all with however you're moving it, it's going to stay locked in place pretty well. And the important thing to note is the Osmo Action 5 Pro or any of the Osmo Action cameras cannot be controlled using this gimbal. So you can either push the record button here on top, which is available still. This doesn't block that. Or you can use your phone, or you can use the DJI remote. If I need to change any settings on the camera, I usually use my phone because some of the screen is blocked here. But the remote from DJI is also a great option for starting and stopping recording on here if you don't want to have to push this while it's on the gimbal. Just want to mention those things so I am setting the full expectation of what this gimbal can and cannot do for you. But again, the reason we want this gimbal is going to prevent those micro jitters. If you have your camera on anything else or holding it by hand, if it's not a gimbal with mechanical stabilization, there are going to be those micro jitters there. And that is going to prevent you from using that slower shutter speed that you need to use. So here are the key settings that you'll need to know to get the best cinematic footage from this camera. First of all, we want to make sure we're in video mode, and we're going to swipe up from the bottom. Right here, you have several options. First of all, you want to do 4K, and I highly recommend 4K 4:3, because later on when you're editing, you're going to have extra vertical resolution here to work with. It's going to allow you to add some extra motion to your scene if you want to, and you're just going to have extra footage to work with depending on how you did your framing. If you'd like to frame it slightly different, you'll have that extra footage. As far as the frames per second, here in the United States, our cinematic standard for movies is generally 24 frames per second. And for TV shows, most of them are 30 frames per second. So I personally prefer 24 frames per second because I like how that looks and feels. But of course, if you don't live in the United States, you probably want to work with 25 or 30 as well. And then up here for stabilization, you'll want to make sure you have Rocksteady on. I don't recommend Rocksteady Plus because that introduces quite a bit of a crop there. You don't get as good a footage, but I do recommend Rocksteady. And then for the field of view, you do have options here, and this is largely just going to depend on what type of scene you're filming. There is a time and a place to use all of these, but if you are filming human subjects or buildings in a city, anything where you don't want any fisheye at all, make sure to use standard dewarp. But in general, I like to use wide as my default. I find that wide is the one that works best. And it is also important to note that if you had stabilization off, if you have a really nice gimbal you're using, you do have to have it in wide in order to have that gyro data later on for gyro flow if you want to use that. If you do not have it set to the lens of wide, there will not be any gyro data available in that footage, and you're going to be stuck without any way to stabilize it. But again, those are what I recommend as my defaults, Rocksteady and wide for most scenes. So now that we've set those, we want to go over here to the advanced parameters, and we want to make sure, first of all, that it's on Pro. If you don't have it on Pro, you're going to see very few options there. So you definitely want to have it set to Pro. Pro is going to unlock all the secrets that you need here. So the first settings we want to change here are exposure. Exposure, we want to go to full manual. And for our shutter speed, since I'm in 24 frames per second, we want to set this to 1/50. Now, as you can see right there, it is very blown out. And we're going to fix that in a moment with ND filters. But what we also want to do is we want to set the ISO range over here, and we want to set that from 100 to 800. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment after we get the ND filter on. So if you look at this currently, this shows that we are at EV +3, so we are way overexposed. So what we need to do here is we need to get out an ND filter. So this ND filter pack contains ND8, ND16, ND32, and ND64. So what I'm going to start with for a day like today is I'm going to start with ND16. I'm going to see what ND16 does for us. So we're going to take that ND filter out and we're just going to pop it right on here. It just goes right over the lens. You don't have to take it off, the lens cover, anything like that. And what we get with ND16 is we still get an overexposed image. Our EV value is +0.7 right now, and our ISO is at 113. So what that means is we need to put on a little bit stronger ND filter. So I'm going to go to ND32. So let's put on ND32 now. And what you'll notice is we get an exposure of +0.3 and we get an ISO of 200. That is perfect. That is exactly what we want there for this particular lighting. So let me provide you some secrets to knowing how to pick the perfect ND filter for any lighting you're working with. This is the reason we set the ISO range from 100 to 800, because it allows the camera to fine tune the ISO to get the exposure right where we want it to be. And the exposure up here, that EV value, you want to see that between -0.3 and +0.3. So anything in that range or EV value of 0 is great. What you don't want to see is you don't want to see the ISO all the way down to 100 or so and the image still overexposed. And you also don't want to see the ISO at 800 with the image underexposed. So that is going to be your guide to knowing what ND filter to use. So as an example here, if I take off ND32, and of course it goes right back to +3 overexposed, but let's say I put on ND64, which is going to be our strongest ND filter. When I put that on, you'll notice the ISO creeps up to 400 and the EV value goes to -0.3. So the nice thing about this ND filter is technically you could still use this with this lighting condition and it would work for you. And if you happen to be at 30 frames per second with a shutter speed of 1/60, you'll see with that slightly faster shutter speed, our ISO creeps up. And let's say you happen to be filming in 60 frames per second with a shutter speed of 1/120. Let's say you want to do a little bit of slow motion there. That would be a case where this ND filter would be too strong. So it takes our ISO all the way up to 800. Even at ISO 800, the EV is -1. So our footage is too underexposed. So in that situation, you would take off ND64 and it would quickly be overexposed again to 2.7, but you would try ND32 and see if that works. So ND32 is good if you were doing 60 frames per second with a 1/120 shutter speed, but the ISO is still a little higher than I like to see at 580 there. It doesn't leave you a lot of wiggle room if you were to turn and face a slightly darker direction. So in this case, I would still take off the ND32 and I would put on ND16. My guess is ND16 will probably get us the exposure we want. So yes, at ND16, it takes our ISO down to 294 and it takes our EV value right there to the perfect 0.0, which that right there is a great exposure to work with. Now I have tried using static ISO values before, but I have found it's really tricky to get that perfect exposure because rarely are you working with lighting that's constantly the same. The lighting is always going to be changing somehow. So I do recommend doing that range of 100 to 800, and that usually works perfectly, and it allows me to fine-tune my exposure. So once we've got our exposure worked out, the rest of these settings are pretty straightforward. You can just hit confirm here, and white balance is what I'll set next. So if you were filming outside in the daytime, you're going to want to select M for manual, and you're going to want to select 5600K. That is a good daytime white balance, and that's going to give you those accurate colors, and your footage is going to look good. It's not going to have a bunch of different white balances later on that you have to sync up. Now, if you are filming near sunrise or sunset, you're going to want to put this to 6500K. That's going to make sure you have the right colors for that time of day. But right now it's the middle of the day, so we're going to go back to 5600K. For the color mode, I recommend working with D-Log-M 10-bit. D-Log-M 10-bit is going to give you footage that you can grade later on, and it's going to look really good. So for the color mode, once you've set it to D-Log-M, I also recommend turning color recovery on. Color recovery is going to give you an accurate representation of what your footage can look like later on after you've graded it. And then finally, the image adjustments down here are really important. For texture, I recommend setting this to -2. -2 is going to give you the lowest sharpness in your image, and it's going to give you the most flexibility to work with that later on. Cinematic footage is not overly sharp. You want that softer image where you can selectively add sharpness later on. Otherwise, it's not going to look good and it's not going to look cinematic. And then for the noise reduction, since we are manually setting the exposure and keeping the ISO nice and low, I also recommend setting that to -2. -2 is going to help ensure the camera isn't artificially reducing noise, which can kind of give you a mushy looking image. So setting it to -2 is going to make sure that there's as little noise reduction as possible taking place. And one other setting I want to mention here is up here in the general settings. So DJI put out a firmware update a couple weeks ago, and it does allow you to adjust the bitrate now. And with the bitrate, you want to make sure that's set to high. So the setting is right here, and you want to make sure it's set to high. It's going to give you the highest bitrate possible, and that is by extension going to give you the best looking footage possible. And one other thing I wanted to show you really quick is if you do want to capture any slow-mo footage, you'll want to do 4K 4:3 60, or of course 120 if you want really slow-mo. But if your project calls for that, and you want those scenes that are slower motion, just go back here and set it to 60. And then over here, you just want to set this to 1/120 for the shutter speed. So now we're going to talk about the techniques you want to use when filming. So techniques, there's a lot of wiggle room and flexibility there. It's really going to depend on what type of story you're trying to tell. If it's a faster paced story, you're going to use different techniques, and if it's a slower paced story. And the great thing about a gimbal like this is this allows you to get a lot of different creative shot angles that really can help you capture those sequences that advance your story. So some general rules for techniques is I do recommend capturing a variety of shots. So what I mean by that is for each scene, I recommend having a few wider landscape type shots where your subject may be in the distance, something like that. I recommend a few mid shots where you're a good bit closer to your subject. And then I do recommend a few close-ups. But do keep in mind with close-ups, you are using an action camera that has a minimum focal distance of approximately 1.5 to 2 feet. So you want to make sure when you're filming close-ups that you're not too close. You need to make sure you're staying back a good enough distance. But when you're editing later on, you can always crop in a little bit on that shot, and the resolution is high enough on here that you do have plenty of resolution to work with. In addition, I always recommend capturing at least 1 or 2 unique shots for each sequence. So those shots could be something where someone in the scene is doing something like unzipping their tent or putting something into their backpack. Just some of those shots that are not necessarily ones you would think about, but ones that can really help advance your story. And of course, I do recommend different angles when filming with this. So you don't want to always have it like at this height right here. It can be much more creative if you use this lower down. And the nice thing about the gimbal is you can tip it like this, and you could be filming somebody's feet as they're walking along. And when you're using the ND filter with that shutter speed set to twice the frame rate, you're going to get really nice motion blur. So if somebody's walking along the ground or riding a bike, anything like that, the subject moving along the ground, there's going to be nice motion blur, and it's going to feel a lot more real when doing so. And if you do have a human subject, I definitely recommend getting a variety of shots, some from behind the subject, some from the side, some from in front, a whole variety. And it's also good to keep the rule of thirds in mind when you're filming a subject. And generally, you want to have 2/3 of the frame in front of the subject in the direction they're facing. So if a subject is going this way, you want to ideally have your subject about right here, and then you want to have 2/3 of the frame in front of them. And whenever your subject's eyes are in the frame, you generally want to have their eyes along the top third of the frame. Those are some general techniques that are going to help you capture really good cinematic looking footage. And finally, we're at stage 4. So stage 4 is the editing stage. This is the stage after you've used your tools, your settings, and your techniques to capture that cinematic footage. Now we're going to put the finishing touches on it to get that really good cinematic look. And the editing program I'm going to use today in a moment when I go back inside is Adobe Premiere Pro. You don't have to use Adobe Premiere Pro. You could use DaVinci Resolve, Final Cut Pro, basically any of your favorite video editing software. So I'm going to import my sample clips here. So I'm going to go to File, Import. I'm going to go to Desktop. I've got them right here in this folder. I've got 5 of them. I'm going to click Open. I'm going to shift click, select all 5 of these, and I'm going to drop them on the timeline. If you film these in a different frames per second than 24, it won't match your sequence. Or if you did them in the 4:3 mode like I did, it's also going to say that. You can just click Keep Existing Settings. So toggling through Eclipse here, you're going to see that everything looks a little bit washed out. And that, of course, is because I filmed these in D-Log-M. So that's a very flat profile that we're going to be able to color grade. But speaking of color grading, if you are using Adobe Premiere Pro, you do want to make sure the Lumetri color tab is available up here. If you don't see that, go here to Window and select Lumetri Color. And then the other thing you want to make sure of is under the Lumetri Scopes tab, you want to make sure you have Waveform RGB selected. I already have that selected there. You also can do the Parade RGB if you want to over here on the side. That's going to help you balance out your colors if you really want to dig into it. I'm not going to get into all of that today because what I'm going to show you, it's not going to be necessary. But make sure you have Waveform RGB. And then down here, make sure 10-bit is selected here. It's going to show you the entire spectrum from the shadows to the highlights. And the highlights are in this 80 to 100 zone. The shadows are the 0 to 20, and then the midtones are everything in between. So the first thing we want to do with our clips is we want to convert this from D-Log-M to Rec 709. Rec 709 is going to be our default color space. That's the color space you pretty much see everywhere, unless you're watching an HDR video, and the HDR video uses a different color space. But this footage was filmed in D-Log-M, and it was not filmed in the HLG mode. So we're going to convert this to Rec 709. And as I mentioned earlier, these steps are going to be very similar regardless of which video editor you're using. But if you are using Adobe Premiere Pro, these steps are going to be an exact match for what you'll need to do. So the next thing we need to do is we need to go to this Creative tab right here. And under Look, we need to apply our LUT. So as I mentioned earlier in this video, I do have 5 free LUTs that I've packaged together into a zip file, and I've linked to those in the description below. You can download those and have them for yourself. You don't have to put in any personal information. You can download them. They're absolutely free. So under look, you want to go to browse. So I've got them right here. It's called DJI Osmo Action 5 Pro LUT Pack. And this is going to be the default one. So this one right here is if you just want to convert it from D-Log-M to Rec 709 and you don't want to change any other looks or feels to it, this is going to be the one you would select. Let me drag this down so you can see what it currently looks like. And when we click open, you're going to see it instantly converts it from D-Log-M to Rec 709. And the colors look very natural there. It brought those out. If I toggle this off, you can see when I toggle it on, everything looks great there. Now, if you did want to do a little bit more grading here, you do have a little bit of flexibility because our highlights here are around 90. They're not bumping up to 100. So that means these clouds here and the brightest part of the sky are technically not overexposed in this frame. We have a little bit of wiggle room at the bottom here, but the shadows are much closer to hitting their bottom before they bottom out and are underexposed. But what we can do is we can minimize this tab and go to curves. And what you can do here is you can put 3 dots. You're going to put 1 dot right here, and this represents the shadow zone. You're going to put another dot here. This represents the midtones, and you're going to put another dot here for the highlights. Basically, wherever this line crosses a vertical and horizontal is where you're going to put the dot. So there are 3 spots here where that happens. So if we want to bring down our shadows ever so slightly to add a little bit of contrast, we can click on this dot right here and bring it down. And as you can see, that adds a nice bit of contrast right there in the darker parts. And if we look over here, technically nothing is touching 0, except maybe this right here, and then maybe a few of these down here. But we're still within the range without underexposing. And then the highlights, we can drag this one up slightly. That's going to add a little bit more contrast. And depending on how bright you want it, you technically can go up a good little ways there. We have quite a bit of range to work with, which is nice. I don't quite want it all that way, but I'm going to go right about there. I do really like how this looks and feels here with that contrast. That looks really good. I'm not going to do any of these other curves because I've got the LUTs there that you can just apply to your footage that make it really easy, and I will show you those in a moment. But what I recommend checking at this point is just look at the skin tones and make sure those look good. In this scene, I would say those skin tones look quite good. They look very natural and they look accurate to what they should be. It was a very windy day, by the way, but I like to play through the clip, just make sure everything looks good. Really beautiful motion blur in that. You can see it along the ground. Love how it looks. And by the way, if you would like to selectively bring out any colors, like for instance, the sky up here, if I wanted to make it a little bit bluer, all you have to do is go down here to hue versus saturation and click the eyedropper tool. And basically this allows you to click on any color in your scene. And when you select it, it's going to show the dot here, and the middle dot is going to be that exact color. So basically what you're doing here is you're adding saturation to that specific hue of color by dragging up the dot. So you can see there, it makes that sky more blue, makes it really pop nicely. It does, of course, make my son's very blue hoodie extra blue as well. So keep that in mind. If you have other colors in your scene that are also blue, it's going to do that as well. Let's say we wanted to bring out the color of pink on my daughter's hoodie here. You could click on that, and then you could drag that up there. It's going to really make that pink pop. Or if you wanted the pink to show less, you could drag down if you want it more muted. So I encourage you to play around with that. You really can do a lot of really cool creative things. For this particular scene, I'm pretty happy with how it looks. I like how it looks. But if you want to do that, keep that in mind. So if we check this creative tab, if we toggle it off, you can see how far we've come there. And if we toggle off curves as well, you can see how drastic of a difference it is from where we started to where we are now. So after you've applied these effects to this scene, if you wanted to take that exact color grading and apply it to other clips in your sequence, all you do is right click and go to copy, and then you could select your other clip. Now, I generally recommend applying it to scenes that were filmed in a similar place. It's going to apply more precisely, and you probably won't have to do much toggling. So let's try this out. You can then right click and select paste attributes. You want to make sure everything is unselected except for the lumetri color. So I'm not going to mess with any of the audio here because we're just focusing on the visual. So I'm going to make sure everything is unchecked except for the lumetri color. And then when I hit OK, it's going to apply it right there and it's going to give that footage the same look. And we want to check our curves over here on the metric scopes to make sure everything's within range. And we can play the clip to make sure everything is within range. That looks really good. Those ND filters on the gimbal gave us that nice smooth motion. We've got the motion blur down here. Looks very good. The colors look great as well. And with this sequence, if we want to see what our starting point was and then where we end up, I'll toggle them off and then turn them back on. And yeah, that's how we end up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete these clips here and I'm going to re-add them to the timeline. I want to clear up anything we've applied to them because I'd like to show you the creative LUTs that I've made. So basically all you need to know for those LUTs is you don't have to apply the D-Log-M to Rec. 709 first because these other LUTs have that conversion built into them. So first of all, let's say we want that classic cinema look. I'm going to select that here and click open. So that applies it right there. You'll see this has a little bit of a subtle green in the shadows and a little bit of red in the highlights. If you notice when I apply it there. So it gives kind of that classic cinematic feel. I really like that. It can be good for a lot of scenes, especially if you're going for that real cinematic look. So I'm going to click undo and I want to apply it to this one where I'm walking in the woods. So you can see how it looks there as well. So we're going to apply it there. And that's what it looks like there. Translates very nicely to that scene. We're going to undo it there. And I want to apply it to this one as well. So I'm going to go back up here. And I'm going to apply it here. We're walking in the woods. I feel like in this scene, it looks just really good. I love how it looks in this scene. And you'll notice we, of course, do have a little bit of overexposure here, but that's fine because that's just the sun up there. I feel like for artistic effect, it actually looks really good in this scene. So I'm actually going to leave that LUT applied to this clip. Let's go back to this one now and let's try out the other LUTs so I can show you how those look. So next, let's select the cold one. As the name implies, this is going to give a cooler look to your footage. So this one can be great if you're on a skiing trip, anything in the great outdoors where you want it to look a little cooler. This is great for any wintertime effect. I instantly feel colder watching that. Looks like a cold, windy day at the beach, which it kind of was. Now, if we undo that, we can go back here and we can apply the blue-orange look. So if you don't know what the blue-orange look is, basically this is going to give you more blues in the shadows and a little bit more orange in the highlights. This can be a desirable look for a lot of different cinematic filming. It can have a really cool feel to it. So you can see there, gives that effect. It is subtle, but it really gives a nice cinematic look to your footage as well. And you'll notice the skin tones still stay pretty natural the way I created this LUT. So I like that about it as well. Finally, let's apply the warm LUT. So the warm LUT, as you might guess, it's going to make your scene feel warmer. This is great for any type of tropical filming, any desert filming, anything like that. When I apply it, you can see that warm feel in both the highlights and the shadows. And I'm going to apply this in the woods as well. Let's go back to this one. I feel like for that autumn look, it can kind of look cool there as well. So that's the look we're going to get when walking through the woods. So those are the tools, settings, techniques, and editing workflow that you need in order to capture the very best cinematic footage with your DJI Osmo Action 5 Pro. If you found this video helpful, I really appreciate a like on it. And if you haven't already subscribed, please hit that subscribe and bell notification button, and you'll be notified every time I publish a new video. Until we talk again, happy cinematic filmmaking.